Welcome to Unlock You with Dr. Shannan Crawford. And today we have the premier expert on anxiety. So many of us have been flooded. We wake up in the middle of the night, our heart is racing, our thoughts are going, and it's exhausting. And we're asking, why is this happening? To understand it and to get some tips. We have Dr. Kevin today as our guest, and he is coming from Louisville, Kentucky to be with us. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for saying Louisville correctly, because now it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Shannan.
Awesome. So I heard you speak at a major conference and you just dropped it. You're like, I'm just going to share the things about anxiety and bring clarity and understanding. And it just brought such peace into the room when I heard you speak. So I was like, we've got to get you on the show. So what got you interested in anxiety? What are your thoughts around anxiety and how can we help people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was one of those rare breeds who, when I went to college, I majored right away in psychology. So I took my first psych course. And I was a two-sport athlete, so I always liked a challenge, and that's actually relevant to the question. So when I studied psychology, I noticed that when I got to abnormal psychology, that anxiety disorders were the most common, 40 million Americans per year. Only 1/3 receive treatment, and yet anxiety disorders are the most treatable. So I saw a hole, right? So I said, this is an area where there's low-hanging fruit to help a whole lot of people in a short amount of time. Sign me up. So I started pursuing that specific aspect of anxiety work. And I went to grad school in it, studied with someone who was an anxiety expert. And then from there became a professor and started studying it myself, publishing and things in the area of the family transmission of anxiety. And then I started a center. So here we are.
Wow. Okay. So what university? People are now going to be applying by the droves. Where are you teaching?
Well, I used to. So I was a professor at the University of Louisville, ironically, and that's where I did my PhD in clinical psychology. And then once I left actually academia, I started the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, also known as KY CARDS.
Wow. Okay. So does that mean you're also training therapists as part of the Institute as well as seeing patients?
Indeed. So everyone, Dr. Shannan, who works with me at KY CARDS, we do didactics where I do a lot of training, conceptualization of anxiety and related symptoms. So I train a lot of clinicians, train our staff on how to treat anxiety in a time-limited fashion. You'll appreciate this, Dr. Shannan, based on what you do. But our motto is rapid relief, lifelong change. And what I tell my clients when I work with them individually is I'm training you to be your own psychologist, right? So that we can reprogram you, right? And then you can, live the rest of your life having managed and regulated anxiety effectively.
So a lot of people are wondering, is it anxiety? Is it just personality? Am I a worrywart? And I also heard you talk about the transmission of family patterns and dynamics, because sometimes we just have family that are just worriers. And so what are your thoughts on that? If someone's listening and they're like, I don't know if I have anxiety, how do they assess? What would be helpful?
That's a good question, Dr. Shannan. So ultimately, I like to tell people that anxiety is something that we all experience. So the short answer is that, yeah, we all have anxiety, but the difference, though, is that anxiety, to define it, it's a future-oriented emotion that involves thoughts of uncontrollability and unpredictability of future events. So we call anxiety preparatory coping because anxiety, when kept in check, can be helpful. Being anxious, on the other hand, is separate. So that's kind of like us saying experiencing anxiety in preparation for, say, a podcast or a job interview or a test, right? Is one thing, but when it's chronic, that's when anxiety is a problem. And like you said, Dr. Shannan, what we do find is that anxiety runs in families. Well, Dr. Kevin, does that mean that there's a specific gene? No, but people who are high on what we call trait neuroticism are set up to experience intense emotions more frequently and intensely than others. So what happens is that, as you know, Dr. Shannan, many people model anxiety for their family, right? So it's kind of like my mom would say, boy, put a coat on or you're going to get pneumonia. Well, that's not how you get pneumonia. But nonetheless, if I'm a child and hear an anxious parent say that, then ultimately my worldview is, well, if mom said that, that must mean it's dangerous to blah, blah, blah. So ultimately, the way we communicate in our families, right, sets the stage for us to view situations in the future as threatening that are not, in fact, threatening.
Right. And so that leads us into catastrophizing. A lot of people have the mindset that if I just anticipate all the bad and I protect myself, then nothing bad's going to happen. What are your thoughts on catastrophizing? Maybe we should also explain that term.
Yeah, so I call catastrophizing one of the two major thinking traps that lock people into intense emotionality. We have what's called catastrophizing, which is AKA thinking the worst. So not only am I magnifying the problem, Dr. Shannan, I'm also simultaneously minimizing my perceived ability to deal with the problem, right? So that's a problem. But we also have what's called probability overestimation, also known as jumping to conclusions. So an example of both of those would be catastrophizing is, this is the worst day of my life, right? This always happens to me. I'll never be successful. See, that's strong language. The problem with that thought is not so much that catastrophizing is quote unquote wrong or bad. The problem with catastrophizing is that when I do that, it restricts what emotions I'm able to experience. It's like saying, Dr. Shannan, if I make my bed, now I have to sleep in it. So in other words, if I'm okay with feeling really anxious and upset, okay, but who is, right? So no one really is, but yet thinking patterns like catastrophizing always lead to intense emotionality, period. And there's no exception to that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so I love the part about even underestimating my ability to handle it when it comes. So we're borrowing trouble from tomorrow, because usually the brain's like a hijacked plane or train that it's left the station. It's going to be the worst case scenario. And so what are common things you hear people catastrophizing about?
Yeah, they tend to catastrophize things about, like you mentioned, being a worrier. So just for your listeners, worry is in response to anxiety. Like, we oftentimes confuse anxiety and worry is always something we attempt to do to problem solve anxiety, which ironically backfires and makes us more anxious, right? So we'll tuck that away for now and put a staple in that. But so that's one piece. But people often catastrophize things like work-related activity, right? Like, this meeting is not going to go as planned. I'm going to make a fool of myself when I give a speech. They worry about their children. Oh, they're not going to make it. Why didn't they call me on time? They must be in danger. Maybe they got kidnapped. So it tends to be the things we normally think about: finances, family, work, school, health, all those sort of categories that are normal categories, but we tend to blow those out of proportion and inflate risk.
Absolutely. And so when you're talking to somebody and you're like, well, I mean, that is possible, right? Like right now we live in a time where Israel is being attacked right now. So bad things do happen. And what's the difference between a healthy amount of like, oh my gosh, what if that came here versus catastrophizing? How do we peel that apart?
Yeah, good question. So typically the issue, Dr. Shannan, is what's the likelihood of that worst case scenario occurring? So to your point, like Israel's a good example. Having distress and groaning about what's happening in Israel is a healthy thing, right? Because it's something that we definitely need to not only just pray about, but also navigate our situations and recognize that there are hurting people right now. So on the one hand, me doing that and travailing and experiencing distress, but yet giving that over is one thing. If I'm being kept up at night, if my work is impaired, if I'm not able to function with day-to-day tasks, that's when we've crossed the line for it to be a problem. So that's what, and you know this, Dr. Shannan, but we often say personal distress, meaning I'm bothered by it, and then impairment in my functioning. Those are the two main criteria for when we know that anxiety and any other problem is a problem.
Absolutely. Because to your point earlier, sometimes an appropriate amount of anxiety and preparation is healthy.
Very much so.
That is okay. But I think you're really highlighting when it starts to kill, steal, and destroy your joy. You're up at night, you can't focus. And then if we just think physiologically, if we have a bank account of reserve of our chemicals, then we're using all of them worrying versus in the moment. Let's say life does happen and something, does happen, then I'm already depleted and burnt out. I've already spent so much time catastrophizing, which is really the dark prophetic, right? It's like visualizing the worst case scenario. And then now when any little bit of evidence comes, now my inner world is like, oh my gosh, it's here. And the whole thing I've been meditating on, now my body is physiologically responding at that level and I'm depleted at that moment. moment. And so
100%.
what are your thoughts about how much we think we're protecting ourselves through self-reliance of, focusing on all the bad to protect ourselves, but actually it puts you more at a deficit than in a strong position if life were to happen?
That's a powerful statement, Dr. Shannon, and I think that you nailed it. Like the Greek word that we know for anxiety, which comes from the word care, merimna, really means anything that causes a distracting care. So when we're actively worrying, we're actively casting our cares on things that have a low likelihood of happening to begin with, which is really ironic. So when you think about it that way, oftentimes what we're doing is we're engaging in what I call IOU. You'll like this. IOU for me stands for an illusion of control.
Yes.
I'm essentially trying to control situations, and it gives me temporary relief to presume I'm doing something productive through worry, through checking behaviors, looking on Dr. Google, who tells you you're going to die anyway. So I feel better temporarily, but what happens is that backfires. And not only does it perpetuate the anxiety, the thing I worried about, Dr. Shannon, doesn't happen.
And ironically, 12 other things that you haven't been paying attention to are more likely to happen.
Right,
because I'm psychodynamic in theory. So our bias is that the thing that you're displacing your anxiety on is actually a buffer to defend against what I'm actually worried about inside. And how many times our anxiety signals come up neutral, and the unconscious mind directs it towards something that feels safer. Like, oh, I'm going to do this about my job and do this about my relationship, somebody's health out there, versus how powerless, scared, vulnerable, insecure, ashamed, underprepared I feel. Then all of those reactions I sublimate and then turn into I'm the worrying, caring, loved one that isn't actually being present with their inner world. And so then I'm actually ignoring or creating other problems that I'm not attending to because I'm displacing all my energy onto this future worry.
No, that's a really good conceptualization. And I think, Dr. Shannon, I think you and I both are saying the same things with different terms. And that is, these are all manifestations of one problem, right? All the things that we're doing, such as worrying, checking, one word summarizes all that, right? Avoidance, or a problem that I have, and I'm trying to do things that I call emotion-driven behaviors that give me a sense of relief, right? But it backfires, like you said, you sublimate, but it backfires and perpetuates the problem.
Yeah. And let me define the term. Sublimate means that I have a reaction to something, I bury it, and then I do the opposite to try to lessen how much it's impacting me inside. And then it defends my view of myself. So like people that may feel like, oh, what if I hurt somebody? What if I'm bad? Then they sublimate and they become super people pleaser, super nice, super helpful and careful and all those things. And so when we don't deal with things appropriately, we're overcompensating. And anxiety is one of our overcompensation strategies. And how have you seen anxiety even in the area of trauma and how that may be a signal that there could be some things back there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with trauma, just like other things we talked about, Dr. Shannon, what we often find is that the whole point of trauma is that I did experience or witness something that was in fact traumatic or life-threatening. So it's interesting because when we think about in a diagnosis like, say, post-traumatic stress disorder, the key word in that diagnosis is post, meaning I'm reliving something that already occurred. So when people experience trauma, like you said, they're often engaging in action tendencies aimed at providing temporary relief. So I might avoid locations of town, certain types of people. Definitely don't bring up the memory, right? Does that give me any relief? Well, yeah, temporarily. But what happens is I create a bubble around myself and I'm not able to heal as a result of that. So what does that mean? Well, I have to confront hard things, the memory itself, locations that are actually in fact safe, and situations that are not in fact dangerous that I think are, need to be confronted so that I can take it captive, reprogram my brain, and realize that that's a bad memory that did in fact happen, but now I can store it away in my brain, my hippocampus, and navigate life despite what happens.
Exactly. And how about even the vicarious trauma? So like right now, and we know it with 9/11 as well, that when people watch a lot of news and trauma, and so right now we know a lot of clients, or not clients, but we're seeing a lot of people who are watching what's going on in Israel and just the horror of that and the feeling of like, oh my gosh, people could come to my house. Like, it pops the illusion of control for all of us. And so what were your thoughts about how do we stay informed about what's going on in the world, but also aware of guarding our thoughts and our mind from too much exposure and how that can lead to vicarious trauma?
Yeah, Dr. Shannon, that's a great question because, that's one that we often have, especially in the media. And that is, if you think about the transmission of anxiety to begin with, we have direct conditioning experiences. So I've gone through trauma personally, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also have two other mechanisms that you alluded to, one of which is observational learning or modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is what you're saying, spot on. And that's the information transmission, meaning vicarious trauma. So if I have a predisposition to experience high emotionality to begin with, all it really takes is for me to be able to watch Twitter too much, or to look online somewhere too much, or to watch a news program too much, for that to create the fear response in my body. And now I have a learned association attached to that as if it could happen to me. Mm-hmm. So with that said, I think that it's important to be informed and to recognize and be aware of my emotions and process those emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Too much of anything can be a problem.
Yes.
So in other words, binge watching the news, making sure I check the updates on what's happening, in Israel and whatnot. It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to check in a couple times, but that shouldn't be allowed to impair my functioning, because then I become too distressed and I'm not able to function on the present moment.
Exactly. Yeah. Which again depletes my internal reserves and causes me to come across in an anxious and potentially controlling way in the present, because I'm displacing my anxiety about feeling out of control. And then I can start showing up in my current life in ways that I have blind spots to. And then that's going to start creating other problems that we're not aware of. So what are the types of anxiety? So people are listening and they're like, where do I kind of fit in that category, or just normal range of healthy anxiety?
Yeah. So we talked about, normal levels of anxiety, when anxiety as an episode, right? Like anxiety is trying to tell me something to pay attention to. A good example of basic normal anxiety is if I have an upcoming test and I'm not good at chemistry, then if I get flooded with physiological arousal, the purpose of that, or the function of that anxiety, is to prepare me by doing what? Studying.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if I use that strategy is that arousal goes down, I feel more confident, I pass the exam, I do well on it, and my anxiety is non-existent. So that's normal anxiety that we should respond to.
Yeah.
But when it's chronic, there's various manifestations. So one type of anxiety we often see, Dr. Shannon, here at the center, is social anxiety. And social anxiety in and of itself is not a problem. But when I have a persistent fear of negative evaluation, it is. So social anxiety takes many different forms. Public speaking is the number one fear in the United States. Fun fact, Family Feud, right? Number one answer on the board. That. But we have like initiating and maintaining conversations, meeting new people, speaking to authority, being assertive. We also have what we call generalized anxiety, which is basically chronic worry. So it's when worry is my response to anxiety in those normal categories we talked about earlier. We also have phobias, right? And you can be phobic of literally anything. I've written quite a bit in that area. So, situations such as driving, elevators, heights, blood injection or injury, getting a shot, costume characters, nighttime, air travel, like there's a number of different phobias that we could have as well.
Yeah.
And then we have, of course, obsessive compulsive disorder, and which is where you have intrusive thoughts that come into your mind that usually cause a lot of distress, and they lead to compulsions and rituals. So anxiety has a number of different manifestations that can be problematic. Then, of course, the one we often see is panic. So panic attacks and agoraphobia, where you have anxiety about being in places where escape might be difficult or embarrassing in the event that I have a panic attack. So those are typically the types of anxieties we see. There's illness anxiety, health anxiety, and things along those lines as well.
Absolutely. And so when you're working with somebody and they're going, okay, this is now affecting my day-to-day life, quality of life, it's affecting, sleep, relationships, it's kind of getting past like, hey, normal and adaptive leads to proactive. Now it's leading to avoidance, fear. I have clients that are like, I don't deal with anxiety. I don't fly. I don't go in crowds. I don't go to, groups of any kind. I stay home. It's like our life keeps shrinking and avoiding to try to protect that anxious state, when in reality, we are being more controlled than we realize. So whether I'm proactively leaning toward action that the anxiety is actually driving me in a good way,
Yep.
propelling or avoiding. So let's say now somebody's listening and they're like, "Oh gosh, this is starting to affect me. I'm ruminating the conversation. I'm not able to truly focus. My mind's going blank at work and I can't really perform in the way that I should be able to, or at school or sports. And so now I'm realizing it's stealing my sleep, my quality of life. I'm not able to function. I want to just stay home and avoid people and groups. So now what is the next step? So we are starting to identify this is the real thing. I want to address it. What do you recommend next?"
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the main thing I would say, my bias, Dr. Shannon, as you can imagine, is you need to seek a mental health professional who specializes in those areas. Like, again, like if you have skin difficulties, going to a general physician is one thing, going to a dermatologist, on the other hand, is another, right?
Yes.
So I say that to say that you're going to get the best care if you go to someone who specializes in treating the problem, right? Clients, as you know, Dr. Shannon, like to see people who speak directly to their problem.
Yeah.
So there's a number of different ways to do that. You have you as a resource, of course, with your listeners. Yeah, we got us, Louisville, and we do virtual as well. So kycards.com is my center website, or drkevinchapman.com is my personal website. But there's organizations like the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, ADAA.org. It's a phenomenal resource. So finding someone who specializes in anxiety is absolutely the next step.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because so much of life, it's like, you don't have to live like that. Just because Aunt so-and-so was a worrywart and this is a thing in our family and it's just something I've compensated for my whole life. You don't have to. Like, we don't have to live on broken legs and just like hobble through.
Right.
And, it's tormenting. Like, you're made for abundant life and you can have abundant life. And there are keys and strategies to help your inner world decide, oh, I'm safe now. Central nervous system, you don't have to so hyper respond to everything. Like, we're okay. And so we would probably address some of our core beliefs.
Yep, 100%. And that's I'm glad you said that, Dr. Shannon, because for your listeners, I like sound bites. So you prompted me. There's two main areas, right, that people who struggle with anxiety struggle in. One is avoidance. And that's not only physiological experiences, but it's also situations, people, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
Also what we call negative appraisals about situations. So I have these negative thoughts. You said catastrophizing earlier as an example, where I develop these negative appraisals or thoughts about circumstances. So technically, those two core areas are very important to help someone reprogram. Avoidance and the action tendencies associated with it, and worry is a form of avoidance, right? Rumination is a form of avoidance. Avoidance is a form of avoidance. And then you have these negative beliefs that we have about ourselves, others around us, and our future that really propel us to engage in these strategies that are a negative feedback loop. We got to break that cycle. And ironically, as you know, Dr. Shannon, we can renew our mind and reprogram ourselves. That's the irony of doing good work, is you can literally change brain functioning when you reprogram how you think.
Yes, absolutely. And then in our psychodynamic approach, we would ground that into parts of self. That there's a part of me that took on the role as a little one, saying, I will make sure I'm safe. I will make sure I don't disappoint others. I will make sure I never fail. And so that's not just a belief system, but that's literally a part of the soul that's still running like an unconscious automaticity in the background in the hard drive. And so now we can introduce those parts of our soul back to the conscious committee, that they don't have to live in this chronic, like, oh, people could be rejecting me. People could be analyzing and judging me. I could be failing at something, and that's going to prove evidence that I am a failure.
Yep,
so when we start identifying, and again, he and I are like really saying the same thing. We just come from different theoretical orientations, I'm assuming. And so when you can identify what is that core belief, and then if you can now visualize, hey, there's a me that's feeling scared. And so a lot of my clients ask the difference, like there's a spirit of fear.
Yes.
And then there's the feeling of scared. Scared is 100% healthy and appropriate. And then when you're scared, you turn toward relationship and get comfort. While when we have unhealthy fear, it causes us to isolate like an orphan. Yep. So if you find when you get anxious that you pull away from relationships, you're dealing with a spirit of fear. When you feel scared and you're like overwhelmed and you want to lean into relationship, then you're allowing that bonding and attaching response that helps down down regulate your central nervous system, having such a hyper arousal, which doesn't mean sexual when you use the word arousal. It means overactive response to the stimulus.
That's so good. So, Dr. Shannan, shout out to the Sound Mind Show. I have a show on YouTube called the Sound Mind Show, and one of the episodes addresses what we call the spirit of fear for your listeners. So, I just wanted to point that out on YouTube, the Sound Mind Show. You'll get some good info on that as well, because we cover that too.
So good, because it's such a common thing. Like if I feel fear and I'm from a background where you're not supposed to feel fear, then we can actually deny parts of us that are scared that actually need attachment. And so when I can say inside of me, hey, scared part of me, I see you. It's okay to be scared. What are you scared about? And I'll just visualize a little one inside of me, a part of myself, not multiple personality, in case anyone's wondering that. It's just parts of self, that we have different systems in our body. We have different organs, all of those parts combined to one whole. And so when I can say, hey, scared part of me, what are you scared about? Now I bind and cast out fear. You don't get to be here in torment, but I can bring reassurance and nurturance. And then that helps calm all those responses down. And then I can actually invite the comforter to bring comfort. One of the names of the Holy Spirit is called the Paraclete, which means helper or comforter, reassure. And so then I have actually greater, it turns together even better than before that flooding of fear, that dread, foreboding just attacked.
I love what you said. Like you're preaching to me. That was great because if I may, it's kind of the difference between where Paul is talking about like us being anxious for nothing and experiencing anxiety are two separate things, right?
Yeah.
Like being anxious is chronic, right? And that's about like you call it the spirit of fear, right? Whereas we have power, love, and a sound mind. So there's a difference between chronic anxiety, which is part of what we're saying, experiencing anxiety, which when regulated can help.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like a healthy fear of the Lord of going, whoa, like a healthy reverent awe, like this is the real deal, right? Like let's be prepared. Let's do the things. But if I want to grow and catalyze into who I'm meant to be, then I probably don't want to stay in a toxic level of fear. And I think that's the point of us having episodes like this, is so many people are literally like being puppeteered by a spirit of fear. It's driving our behavior and we have no idea why we just avoid this group. We don't go to that church. We don't hang out with these people. We don't apply for that job. We don't put ourselves out there. And that's fear sabotaging you. Versus a healthy inner world that's saying, hey, I know that there's something in me and there is opposition. There is something that's bringing fear and foreboding, this impending doom that's going to be bad and is only going to have a negative outcome. Versus there is going to be bad. Life is going to happen for everyone. And there will be good. And God will be with me. And I can tuck my little hand in his big hand. And I've got a whole community of fantastic people like Dr. Kevin and his team and Crawford Clinics and our team that you have support. But many times when we isolate, it does get worse when we isolate versus leaning in and letting relationship be part of that medicine.
Amen. And the thing that happens when that happens, right, Dr. Shannan, is I always say, if I had $1 for every time I interacted with someone who does what you just said, they always say, it wasn't as bad as I thought.
Exactly.
Right? Every single time. So it's confronting that stuff that we're deceived into thinking is dangerous. When in reality, it's not. It's a lie. It's deception.
Yeah. And even like the simple principle of confronting the bully, as kids, you always tell the kid, like, confront the bully. Don't let them stand, in your way and intimidate you. Because there's a spirit of intimidation that can come on people's lives and cause us to shrink back. So if you think of that thought like a bully and you start standing up to it and going, yes, that is possible. X could happen. And that's not the end. There's a ... versus a period. And fear tells you this is what's going to happen. And that's the only outcome. And it's only bad. And you're all by yourself and you're under equipped to handle that job, that marriage, that crisis, that divorce, that bankruptcy, whatever it's going to be, period. But if we can add a ... and learn how to think and in the conjunction of saying this bad thing could happen, the economy could collapse, war could come, that is real. And Nevertheless, I know that God will be with me. And I have a community, a tribe of people who love me. I am not alone. I am allowing love and comfort and reassurance. I'm going to start quoting things that are positive and life-giving, that inspire courage in the midst of feeling fear.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts, Dr. Kevin, of things that are practical people can be doing?
I think the first thing I would say, Dr. Shannan, in terms of strategies is like, number one, it's acknowledging the negative thoughts or the deception that I've believed, that I've developed as it relates to going into these uncomfortable situations. See, there's a difference, Shannan, between things being uncomfortable and unmanageable. That's huge, because being uncomfortable is something we're accustomed to. It being intolerable is a completely set of different affairs. So we have to know going into a situation that I can tolerate being uncomfortable. So that's point A. What are the thoughts I've learned to think, and how do I counter those thoughts with truth? I didn't say positive per se. I said truth. It is that I'm able to deal with these things because that's not who I am, right? Despite how I'm feeling. So separating that out. Another thing I like to tell people, Dr. Shannan, is that we can't treat our thoughts like facts.
Yeah.
We treat them like hypotheses, right? Many people who struggle with fear and anxiety often treat their thoughts as facts, when in reality, they need to treat them like hypotheses, right? So feelings aren't facts is another way I like to say that. I like to use a technique called anchoring. And anchoring is this idea that before I proceed, I'll take a step back to process what's actually happening and doing what I call a 3-point check before I confront something. What am I thinking right now? How am I feeling in my body right now? What am I doing or feel like doing right now? So I'm processing what's actually taking place in my mind, acknowledging it, not judging it. And then I'm saying, what's the most important thing to do in the present? And then I confront the situation based upon that. But I always do it pre-gaming by identifying those 3 parts, that 3-point check: thoughts, physical sensations and feelings and behaviors, and then I confront that situation. That's kind of a practical takeaway in that regard.
It's so good. So let's do a vignette. Let's walk people through it. So let's say John is anxious about a job interview. And so he feels like, oh, I've been fired before, or things haven't worked out before. And so that's automatically feels like it's going to be the end result, or I'm going to be negatively evaluated. I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. My wife's going to leave me, whatever the variables are. How would you anchor him and help him through that?
So first of all, if we follow those steps, I would identify what you did already. What are the negative thoughts I've told myself? So the narrative John's developed would be something like, I've failed before, I'll fail again. So we have to challenge that thought, because it's going to lead me to the action tendencies associated with not doing the job, right? So, I would challenge those with what I call, Dr. Shannon, disputing questions. And disputing questions are questions like, well, John, what's the evidence that thought is true? Right? Does failing in the past mean you're going to fail in the future? So we challenge those thoughts with evidence, not positive thoughts, but with evidence. So we change and shift that thought to something that's much more flexible. I didn't say positive. It can be if it's true, right? So a flexible thought. So we get John to say, okay, got it. Failing in the past doesn't mean I'll fail again. I'm capable and I'm prepared is a thought I'm meditating on, despite how I'm feeling in my body. So now he's going into it saying, I'm capable and I'm prepared. Second thing is to anchor by saying that, right? I'm thinking this, I'm feeling this, I'm doing or feel like doing this. And that might be, I feel like not going, I feel like calling in sick, I feel like just canceling it altogether. Well, what's the most important thing to do in this moment? Well, I need to put on this thought and meditate on the idea that I'm capable and I'm prepared, and they don't expect me to be perfect. So I put that on, right? And then I go into the situation with an achievable behavioral goal, meaning I'm not going to be perfect, but what is something that's easily observable by other people that would indicate this was a success? Is it that I simply go? Is it that I ask 2 questions, right? Is it that I say something about myself that I typically wouldn't say in the past? Bottom line is that I have to go into that situation with an achievable behavioral goal. And then after the fact, I debrief with myself and ask myself a simple question, Dr. Shannan: what did I learn? And that consolidates what I learned in that situation and allows me to say, despite how I felt, I was still a success. Despite what I thought, it still worked out. Despite me thinking I wouldn't get the job, I did. Like, so that teaches my brain a very powerful new association that I can use again and again and again through repetition. And now I'm a new person.
That's so good. That's so good. And even just the exposure, right? Like
Yep.
we've said before, the more you avoid something, the bigger the fear around that grows. The more you expose, the body learns, oh, it's not that bad. Like it may not be super comfortable, but it's not horrific like I thought. And I was just thinking as you were talking, when I was a kid, I moved to a new school and all the pretty cute girls had this beach party. And I'm like the new chubby kid. And I'm like, oh, I don't have any friends. And my mom is like, young lady, you have to show yourself friendly to be friends, to gain friends. So you're going to go to this birthday party. And I'm like, sixth grade is such an awkward time. I don't understand that whole period and why that has to happen in our lives, except humility. So I was an awkward kid and you have to go to your bathing suit at the beach. I'm from California. So just so many awkward moments right there, right? And so she said, I will stay in the car and you go and show yourself friendly, make some friends, but I will be here. If you need to come out and it gets too much, I will be right here. I'll read my book and blah, blah. And at the moment, I'm sixth grade. I didn't even think about it until later. And I'm like, wow. If she had not done that, how many parties I probably would have avoided, how many relationships I probably would not have developed. But because I learned over exposure of going, hey, it wasn't that bad. There were some awkward little fumbly sixth grade moments. But besides that girl was nice. And then she said hi in the hall later. And so it built a confidence at the next birthday party. She's like, okay, I'm going to stay for 10 minutes and then I'll head out and you can call me if you need me. And so it was like she was titrating or stair stepping my socialization in a new school when all the other kids knew each other and I'm the new kid. And so I just love the opportunity, like you're saying, almost like research, what we would call a null hypothesis, that I have to actually verify, I believe this is true, what's not true about that, before I can just jump to conclusion that that's automatically true. Because as a kid, I'm like, I am going to be rejected. These kids are all cliquey, they're mean, blah, blah. And I didn't know them. That is totally unfair. But my emotional reasoning is they're all snobs and they're going to reject me. And so I was already anticipatory dreading and judging them.
Yep.
Which then could create a self-fulfilling prophecy of being a brat because I'm anticipating them being a brat. But instead, having that reassurance that mom's right here if I need to go, So any parents listening, that was really good parenting. And it did help me socially because I think I probably would have had a lot of social anxiety if that hadn't happened. And so we now expose ourselves and then, like, to your point, coming back and saying, hey, that wasn't that bad. I can try it again and I can give myself a pat on the back. It may not have been perfect, but it wasn't as bad. And now I can build that confidence in that area.
100%. You nailed that. And that's exactly what happens is our brain is equipped to create these associations, right? So when you confront a situation through exposure, you learn a new non-threatening association, and that plants the seed that you then water through repetition. And then now your brain is, well, I just go to parties, as opposed to, oh, there's a party, Jaws music, and, right? Start flipping out. So.
Yeah, exactly. Or academically, I was really struggled. And so another memory is coming to mind of, if anybody out there, if you've ever struggled academically, like it's a lot. It's so scary to have to go to a big test.
Yep.
And I was going to do the GRE, which is for the grad school. It's like the SAT equivalent, but now you're going into grad school. So our family, we don't have a lot of college education in our background. I wasn't coached. I didn't know that that's like a thing you have to do. And so I find out, my mom's like, all right, I'm flying in to LA where you live, and we're going to study for a weekend. And Shannan, just treat it like a practice. Exposure, just do practice and don't put too much psychological stress. Obviously, she didn't say that phrase, but now in retrospect, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was really brilliant. By not having the stakes so high, I felt my body relax and be able to go like, oh, I'm just practicing.
Yep.
And so when I passed the exam supernaturally, glory to God, I was getting like a 500, like it was real bad. On my practice exams. And then magically I got like a 1070 the next morning, and I needed at least like a 1050 or something to even be admitted or considered into grad school. And so I really think a big part of it, obviously prayer, but secondly was that I didn't put the pressure on myself that like, grad school, my future, my career, my dreams are resting on this one test.
Yep.
So how do you coach people through changing the amount of pressure that they put on one isolated event that they may be building up in their mind?
Well, I think that's one of the most important components of debunking thoughts that I treat as facts, is because if you get a person, rather than what most people do, Dr. Shannan, they tend to do what I call stroking. It's kind of like reassuring someone, oh, you'll be fine. Oh, you're prepared. Oh, you're beautifully and wonderfully made. It's okay. When in reality, we do that because, number one, it's awkward to be around someone who's feeling really heightened distress, but also we love them, so we don't want them to feel bad. But that's actually the wrong approach. The right approach is to get them to see it objectively by identifying all the overwhelming evidence that's contrary to what they think, right?
Yeah.
So again, evidence-based questions, I help you identify and dismantle perceived pressure, right?
Mhm.
It's like, oh, this test is going to define my life. Well, Dr. Shannan, you said it earlier, that's catastrophizing. One test does not define anything,
Yeah.
right? So the idea of saying, well, what's the evidence that this one exam will dictate the rest of your life? See, if you ask the right questions, then people start to realize that they're basing their reality on feelings rather than facts. So you have to help them see logically, well, what's the evidence that that's true? Are you 100% sure that the GRE is going to dictate your future? The ironic sidebar, Dr. Shannan, as you and I know, the GRE is only a predictor of your first year of success of grad school. It predicts nothing else. Is that it's just basically like a rite of passage to make sure that you can think clearly, right? But it doesn't really predict much of anything. So nonetheless, I say that to say, as we help people identify the types of thoughts that are getting in the way of their action tendencies, we help them be more flexible, which to your point, and your mom did a phenomenal job, decreases the physiological arousal that you have, and then you're able to think clearly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So any last little tips, tricks, hacks that you would share with our audience as we're wrapping up for today?
Well, I think the main thing I'd say, Dr. Shannan, is something that I'm coming back to, and that is recognize, do not judge anxiety. Being anxious and experiencing anxiety are two different things. Normalize anxiety. Anxiety is rarely a problem unless it's chronic. If you're personally distressed by it and your functioning in one or more areas is impaired because of it, there is great help like Crawford Clinics, like us, KY Cards, Dr. Kevin, Chapman.com. You can find me on all the socials and whatnot. We can help you, and we would love to partner with you and to help you navigate these things, including sports performance, other anxiety symptoms clinically. But the bottom line is, don't judge the anxiety, but if you recognize that it's more than what you like, then there's help available in a short amount of time.
I love that. And we also have e-courses on drshannancrawford.com. So that's spelled differently, Shannan, Shannan, Crawford.com. And we can help also just take you through understanding what's going on inside and practical application of things that can help. Thank you so much, Dr. Kevin. This has been such a joy. And I would love to do an episode. I'm putting you on the spot. We'll see you for the next episode. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for investing in yourself, your family, and your team. We are honored to serve you and your vision.